Right, so today we are testing Starfield with the RX 7600 non-XT. So today we're pairing this GPU with a 12400F CPU from Intel, which is a 6-core 12-thread CPU. That is again paired with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 megahertz CL18 memory. So not the most high-end system, but a pretty mid-range system if you want to put it like that. And we'll be testing at 1080p, 1440p. We'll probably not be testing at 4K. The game is pretty intensive, even at 1080p. Right, so let's just go over the settings here quickly. Let's just get rid of that. Currently, I am on the Ultra preset. I just disabled FSR. So Ultra preset, no FSR, 1080p native. All right, let's start our benchmark run here. And right off the bat, it's definitely not looking good. So not even getting close to 60 frames per second here. This is one of the more intensive areas in the game. So I'm just going to be testing it. So what you see here, this is probably the lowest you'll get in the game. Some areas might be a little bit more intensive, but those are few and far between. Most other areas you should get slightly more, and indoor areas you'll get quite a lot more. I've seen it go up to around 140 frames per second even with these settings in some indoor areas. So I'm not going to be testing too much at 1080p Ultra at native because we can't get 60 frames per second, so it is kind of pointless. So let's just see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second at 1080p on the Ultra preset. I'm not going to change the preset. It's going to play around a bit with the FSR. You can see that in the top left hand corner, our GPU usage is pegged at 100%. Our CPU usage is around 50%. Now I know there's a lot of discourse around this game regarding CPU bottlenecks and GPU bottlenecks, etc. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. This GPU actually performs quite a lot better than the 4060, which is a similar class, but there's an issue with NVIDIA GPUs for sure. But 40 frames per second at 1080p Ultra is definitely not ideal, and I don't think we are CPU bound. The GPU usage there is pegged at 100% most of the time, so unless something else is making the GPU not being fully utilized in some other way, I honestly don't think we are CPU bound at the moment. Right, so let's just see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. Spoiler alert, I did test it, and I couldn't get 60 frames per second at 1080p Ultra. So let's just enable FSR 2 here, right? And then we'll just you don't have quality settings anymore, so you can't select quality, balanced, performance, etc. You now have a render resolution scale slider, right? So 50% would be performance or ultra performance, half of the resolution it's supposed to be anyway. So let's just go back and reset our numbers here. And even with FSR sitting at a render resolution scale of 50%, we are barely seeing 60 frames per second. But that's not the worst. Just look at the vines here. Don't they just look awesome? I mean, right, so as you get closer, they do look slightly better. They are very pixelated. But then again, we are rendering at like 540p, so this is to be expected, but the performance definitely is not to be expected. All right, so no way we can get 60 frames per second at 1080p on the Ultra preset. So let's just go down to the high preset. Now, one thing that you just need to note is that if you play around with the presets, you'll see that the render resolution scale gets adjusted as well. So even on the Ultra preset, it starts off with a render resolution of 75%, right? So that's definitely not native, but we'll go down to high and we'll disable FSR because we want to test it native. And let's just start our counter here, and not looking good. 50 frames per second again. I mean, this is pretty much what we had on the Ultra preset with FSR set to 50%. So Ultra is definitely not the way to go. This does look okay. I mean, it's not the best looking game out there, but it's also not the worst. It has its issues for sure. And you can see that we're still dropping below 50 frames per second in this specific area. That's not even with any combat. So let's just start some combat here. Let's get out this gun. you'll see that depending on how much action there is on the screen, it'll sometimes drop into the low 40s. Now I know that the consoles are playing at 30 frames per second, but you play on PC, you'd expect at least 60 frames per second. That's my minimum anyway. I prefer higher because I've got a high refresh rate monitor. So 60 frames per second is basically minimum for me. And also, I know it's an RPG, but it does have a lot of FPS elements. So you do want a little bit of a higher refresh rate or higher frame rate just for that reduced input latency and increase the motion fluidity, especially when you are fighting. Alright, so we couldn't get 60 frames per second at the high preset. So let's just see what FSR setting we need to use to actually get 60 frames per second here. I don't expect we'll need much. So I'm just going to enable FSR here, and we'll just set it to 75% as it is on the Ultra preset. I think that should be enough to get us 60 frames per second. Let's just reset our numbers here. And alright, still not. Now, I know that the 7600 is a very entry-level GPU, and I actually got Starfield with that GPU when I bought it for the channel, but definitely not a great experience this. I mean, sub 60 frames per second on 1080p high on a brand new 1080p GPU. I mean, this is definitely not what you'd expect, right? So I'm just going to run around a bit. The AI was also pretty stupid. You can just see they're just running around, and now they start shooting. Some of them just get like, I'm right here, and they just run away. So definitely a lot of issues in this game still, but I've been enjoying it. I could just take it for what it is. At the moment, I'll just recommend you get it on Game Pass. Don't spend the $70 on this game just yet. Let's see if they can actually get this better with some patches. Alright, so still no 60 frames per second here. Alright, oh, here we are. We should actually fight here. But you can see inside the frame rate definitely does go up. It depends on where you are. Some areas in some planets or on some planets, once you enter the world unloads, and like just that small portion of the map is loaded, and as I said, I've seen 120 plus frames per second, even at 1080p ultra in certain caves, etc. So I'm just testing this as a worst case scenario. Alright, so that's it for 1080p high. I mean, let's just see one thing, sorry, before we do that. Let's just lower this down to like 66% and see if we can actually maintain 60 frames per second. Doubtful, and like 60, we're getting close to 60, right? But it's still dropping below 60 at points, and it will definitely do that if there's more action on the screen here. But now the game just looks terrible. I'm not a big fan of using upscaling tech at 1080p, but for this game, unfortunately, you need to. Alright, so this gave us almost 60 frames per second. I'm not willing to reduce the resolution scale even more because the game already looks very pixelated. Not even just soft, it's definitely extremely pixelated and not the experience that you'd want, right? So let's just drop down to medium. Right, so on the medium preset, you'll see that the render resolution scale is now at 50%, which is terrible. So let's just go ahead and disable that. The rest of the stuff you can leave as is. We tested with the depth of field, so I'm just going to leave that on. I usually play with that off. So let's just once again restart our numbers here. And maybe I should just reload my save. Alright, so I just reloaded my save and reset the numbers here. And on the 1080p medium preset with FSR disabled, still dropping below 60 frames per second, but I think we'll be close to 60 frames per second most of the time. Still terrible, but so it goes. Let's just start some fighting out. But you can see still not maintaining 60 frames per second. Sure, there's a lot of NPCs here running around now, and that is quite heavy on the system, and they just stopped. Like, the threat has passed apparently. I think this is probably where I'd play this game if I had this GPU in my main system. 1080p medium and native. I mean, we are getting pretty close to that 60 frames per second. That dropping below it every now and again wouldn't be the biggest issue. Well, for me personally anyway. So 1080p medium seems to be quite okay, and as I said, this is pretty worst case scenario. Other areas you'll definitely get a higher frame rate. One thing that I did notice is if it rains, especially the acid rain, the frame rate does drop, but that doesn't happen too often, luckily. That said, this game definitely does need some optimization, or you just need to buy a better PC, according to Mr. Howard. So I'm going to go down to 1080p low here just to see what kind of frame rate we can actually get. So low, and just disable FSR here. Alright, and let's just reset our numbers here. If you are wondering why I'm not dying, I do have pretty decent armor. I cheesed it. If you go to the lodge, you go down to the basement, there's some decent armor in a glass case there that you need to unlock, but the lockpicking skill required is pretty high. But there's a small gap you can actually interact with the armor without unlocking it. So I just stole it that way. I know. It's a Bethesda game, so I mean anything goes. So getting now quite a much better frame rate, getting around 70 frames per second. You can see the average there is 72, which is definitely much better. Low doesn't look too terrible. I mean, low looks better than lowering the render resolution. Personally, that's my opinion. I mean, I do prefer sharper images, even though they're not as detailed, to heavily upscaled images. So definitely native 1080p on the low preset seems to be the way to go. Even medium should be fine. It's definitely not the worst experience. You'd expect a lot better. I'm not going to argue that, but I'm just here to talk about this game in particular. Alright, so that's going to be it for our 1080p testing. Let's move on to 1440p, and for that I need to restart the game. Alright, we're now at 1440p. Let's once again start off on the ultra preset and native resolution here. Don't expect anything good coming out of this. It takes a while for everything to load in, and let's just reset our numbers here. So if you want to play at 30 frames per second, you want to get the Xbox experience, then 1440p on the ultra preset is definitely the way to go. I mean, the game definitely looks a lot better, a lot sharper. The screen does tear a bit. This is just my capture card. It does support VRR, but with this Radeon GPU, if I do enable VRR whilst I'm recording, the screen just goes black every now and again, which is kind of annoying. On the recording itself, it doesn't go black, but on the pass-through screen, I can't see what's happening. So I just disable VRR, and that's why you're seeing some tearing. Alright, so 30 frames per second. Let's see if it can actually drop below 30 frames per second. I don't think it'll drop below 30 frames per second. Yeah, it seems to be a pretty good stable 30 at least. If you lock it to 30 frames per second using Afterburner or something similar, the frame time graph would be a lot smoother as well, and I'd guess some people would be okay playing like this. Me personally, definitely not. This girl is not in a hurry at all. Like it's like she's just on her morning jog, definitely not trying to run away from any danger whatsoever. All right, anyway, 30 frames per second it is, and not something that I'd be happy with. Let's just kill this stupid robot if I can, and then we'll move on to different presets. So just if you have a look at the performance at 1440p, you'd understand why I'm not going to be testing at 4K. It will just not be a very good experience, right? And also the game only has a native FSR support. Obviously the Radeon GPU only has FSR anyway, but on DLSS on my test system, the upscaling is actually a lot better than FSR. All right, but that's enough about that. Let's lower the detail and see if we can hit 60 frames per second at 1440p. Well, first off, at 1440p, I'd be okay using some upscaling. So we'll just use the FSR2. Let's just make it the same as what the ultra preset should be. We can just as well do that. So now it's on 75% and 1440p, right? So let's see if that helps us getting 40 frames per second. So we gained 10 frames per second. There's a big difference in the responsiveness of the game because obviously it's only 10 frames per second, but yeah, that's around 25% in performance increase. So the big numbers when it comes to percentages. Anyway, so 1440p ultra are not going to happen. I don't think we should try different FSR settings either. Let's just go down to the high preset and see what happens. So we're on the high preset now, and let me just get rid of that, and we'll once again disable FSR. So 1440p high native resolution. Once again, I don't expect good performance here at all, and into the 40s. So pretty much the same as what we had on the ultra preset with FSR enabled. Let me just reload my save. I'm running out of bullets and out of health here. All right, so let's just reset our numbers after the save, and it's still getting 40 frames per second. Not ideal. Once again, using the scroll to switch weapons. It doesn't work in Starfield, unfortunately. It's quite annoying, but that's just how it goes. Or you can just use the Q key and you can select whichever weapon you want from the wheel here. Okay, so let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. This is a pretty decent looking setting, 1440p high. I mean, the resolution is quite good and the texture resolution is terrible. I mean, just look at that. Some textures do look good, like the wall here, it looks okay, but the painting or whatever that is, that just looks so stupid. A lot of areas have very contrasting texture details. You'd see great texture detail, and right next to it something with no texture whatsoever. All right, so let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second here. So let's just play around with FSR. As I said, at 1440p, I'm okay with using FSR, just as long as you don't go too low. So let's just go to 67% here, and let's reset our numbers. So we're not getting much, right? So it's 50 frames per second. We went up from 40 frames per second. So once again, another 15-20% performance increase. And the game still looks okay. I mean, it's not the end of the world. Text just doesn't look that great, especially moving text. But if you have a Radeon GPU, the FSR is the only upscaler that you can use at the moment. There are some mods that can install XeSS for you, or DLSS if you've got an NVIDIA GPU. But with the Radeon GPU, you can still use XeSS if you install the mod. All right, so still no 60 frames per second. Let's see. Let's just go all the way down. So 50% render resolution. So 720p basically. Reset our numbers, and getting close enough to 60 frames per second that I'd be happy to play at this frame rate considering the game's performance, but the game doesn't look that good now anymore. I mean, it didn't look great at the start, but now it just looks worse. So I mean, just look at the finer detail there in the background as you move. It's just because we've got very little detail to work with, and then it's trying to upscale to a higher resolution. That's just how it goes with some upscalers in some games. So still not a solid 60 frames per second experience, and not one that I'd recommend, because everything just once again, I'm not saying it's looking soft, even though like maybe in the YouTube video it'll just look soft, but it is very pixelated as well. All right, but that's the best we'll be able to do at 1080p on the high preset. So let's move over to medium. Right, so on the medium preset, just once again disabling the upscaling there, and let's reset our numbers. So slightly lower than what we had at the high preset with the FSR at 50%. Okay, might be even even lower than expected, or than I thought. Getting 44 frames per second at times. Let's see what happens if we actually start fighting. If people will actually fight me, it'll help. I'm not the best shot with this gun, although it's I'm going to blame its accuracy number. It's at 12%, at 66%, 12%. What am I on? So not the most accurate gun, and I'm not the most accurate player either, and the combination is just something atrocious. Alright, still, I mean, we're maintaining like mid 40s, and if this is what you, well, if you're fine with 30 frames per second, then this is definitely fine. Lock it to 30, you'll get a very decent 30 frames per second experience. Most PC players though, well, I say most, but most PC players that I know prefer 60 plus, so let's see what FSR setting we need to use to get to 60 at 1440p on the medium preset once that guy dies. Alright, so medium, but this time with the FSR enabled. Let's just go with 75% render resolution here. I don't think we'll hit 60 frames per second. We'll probably have to go down to 50. But let's see. So 55, we'll see 60 every now and again, which is good. I don't know what happened there. Looked like I hit him with the grappling gun. And I mean, once again, this is playable. Personally not playable to me, but I do know a lot of people wouldn't really mind this if you're aiming for 60, dropping below into the 50s, the mid 50s. It still feels okay latency wise, almost the 60 frames per second. Let's just drop this down to, not there, let's just drop this down to 60%, so down from 75%. Reset our numbers, and let's just reload my save here. Right, let's reset our numbers. So 1440p medium with the render resolution scale set to 60%, and it looks like we should be around 60 frames per second. It'll probably drop below 60 frames per second at times, but maybe not as often. And as I said, this is one of the more demanding areas in the game, so other areas you'll probably maintain 60 even if there is a lot of action on the screen. We haven't dropped below 60 yet, so which is definitely good. 0.1% lows aren't the best though. I think we dropped below 60 there for the first time, but this is okay. And at 1440p at 60% resolution scale, it does look okay. I mean, it doesn't look the best, but you get a playable 60 frames per second, and the visuals are acceptable, I'd say, for the settings. So if you want to play at 1440p medium, obviously you can manually tweak the settings. Hardware Unboxed did a settings video, an optimized settings video. Digital Foundry did one as well, I believe. So I mean, you can definitely tweak the settings a lot more and get a little bit more out of the system, but I'm just here to test the presets to give you an idea of what the performance is like. Right, so let's move on to the low preset here. I don't think we'll get away without using FSR even on low, but let's see. I'm just going to reset the numbers here, and 55 frames per second. It's once again, it's close to 60, but I mean, it dropped down to 46 there, so not really that close to 60 anymore, unfortunately. Anyway, so still not hitting 60 frames per second, although, I mean, this is a very entry-level GPU. I'd be okay playing like this if you had to play at 1440p native, but it can definitely be improved. So I'm just going to let's just move FSR down to 75%. It'll still look pretty good, relatively speaking, and as soon as I can actually click it. So let's just go down to 75%, and now we should be able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times. Nope. All right. So you'll have to use even more aggressive FSR if you want to maintain 60 frames per second. Like, what's going on here? Oh, he's on the other side of the glass. So if you want to maintain 60 frames per second, you'll have to use more aggressive upscaling. Unfortunately, no amount of tweaking is going to get you above 60 frames per second. I mean, everything is already on low, so this is as good as it's going to get at 1440p, unless you lower the render resolution even more. Alright, but I think this is good enough to give you an idea of what the performance is like. As I said, this is a worst case scenario. This area is very demanding, so expect higher frame rates in different areas. This is just to give an idea of what the performance is like in the city, which is very demanding, right? Alright, so that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.